Hello and welcome back and to this next episode of Mapping the Shadow. So I wanted to take this episode here just to talk about the journey of how we've got to this point philosophically. And what's largely inspired this is simply that, well, shadow work is becoming a very trendy topic, has been for a while, increasingly so, and often associated with Jung, of course, and certain Jungians, people who collaborated with Jung, and continues to this day. But what's often overlooked is what came before Jung. And whilst every thinker contributes something crucial to this discussion, and there's much more still to be unpacked and understood, there's a danger, of course, in doubling down on one person's thoughts about it and holding that as gospel. I think Jung would have certainly agreed with that. Jung himself said many things that alluded to this fact, and he actively encouraged, not to project unnecessarily certain aspects onto him or anybody. And I've already shared many aspects of shadow work, which, even though these issues didn't arise with Jung, they certainly are very present today. Certain assumptions, especially around things like projection and almost a complete disregard of the problem of evil, even though certain Jungians like Murray Stein and James Hollis have certainly talked about the problem of evil and how it relates to shadow work. By and large, it's a subject mostly left out of discussions of shadow work and shadow work coaching. And you could even make the case that actually evil is not only not irrelevant to shadow work, it's actually its final destination. If it wasn't a question of morality, it wouldn't be shadow work. If there weren't judgments being made, there would be no shadow. And so it's most ironic that we talk about shadow so often and do not even speak of evil, what evil means. Perhaps in part because it's, in some sense, the ultimate subject. Good and evil, what can that even mean? And who dares even answer the question? How can anyone possibly say what is evil and what isn't evil? We're met with the same problem. The moment you try and capture it in words, delineate it, oh, that's evil, this isn't, we need not look very far for issues and instances of where that goes off the rails. That's the story of our very culture. And so where to even begin with this? Well, it's vital that we do begin. Thankfully, we have begun. Society isn't anarchy. We do have a legal system. It's often pretty terrible and corrupt. And yet, the sort of modal stage of where society currently is, at least in the West, is significantly better than what it could have been or what it was 3,000 years ago, right? So some rules are better than no rules, but there's still a profound lack of nuance in how these things operate. Even our most advanced societal systems greatly lack nuance. There's a kind of subplot here going on. The main plot, I think it's fair to say, philosophically, is what we see all around us. It's what we encounter when we go up the street and go and buy a new pair of jeans at the shopping mall. It's what we learn in sixth form college. It's what we are implicitly told when we go to work at our tech startup, that if we just make more dollars, everything will be great, right? If we can just wrangle with the world a certain way, we'll solve all our problems, and then we won't actually even have to confront our feelings. Whew, thank God for that. And that is the story of materialism, guys, right? That is the dominant paradigm that has been at the center of all our cultural movements for the last 300 years. And little do many folks know, there's a whole other paradigm, and it's called idealism. Now, it's not to say that these two can't be reconciled in some way, but the drive for reconciliation is coming from idealism, not from materialism. Idealism is the antithesis to materialism in many ways. Idealism simply means you think of it as ideaism, in fact. At its core, it's the notion that mind and ideas are primary to existence as opposed to material. The idea that material is the forerunner to existence has served us pretty well for the last 300 years. And it itself is a moment, it's a step in this dialectical process towards understanding. It itself was a response to what was happening before, which you might loosely class as dogmatism or absolutism. Absolutist religion had a lot of value. I mean, that was cutting edge technology 2,000 years ago. That solved a lot of problems. It's always existed in various forms, in various levels of sophistication as well, varying levels. And there's been arguably great periods of civilization rather, that humanity took massive back steps for whatever reason. They had to rediscover some of these things. But each of these is like a meme or a step on this onward journey. Each is a mere stepping stone, and yet each contains vast worlds of thought and utility. So idealism is not dead. In fact, it's having a resurgence, and for good reason, because materialism is looking more and more faulty at its essence. It's done a wonderful job of helping us to model existence, helping us understand physical reality and what's going to happen, what happens when you burn this fuel and create energy here, or convert it into energy and you can drive a car with that. What happens when you isolate certain key performance metrics? What happens when you decide that, hey, economy is good for us, let's boost GDP? When this number goes up, we solve a bunch of problems. We have more food, we can increase our lifespan. Therefore, if we just make this number go up more and more and more and more, ad infinitum, then we'll make our well-being go up ad infinitum. And it will be completely surprising when that goes off the rails and creates other externalities that we then have to deal with. And at some point we realize that that too was merely a vehicle, was merely a way to access something, unlock a next stage. So let's move to the next slide here. So I just want to give a very, very brief and cursory ode to several thinkers who have informed this whole process. Each of these thinkers has been inspirational to me and has offered something of value that goes into this model that I'm sharing, the shadow map. And you can see, for those who are watching on video, there are 10 faces here. The 9th and 10th faces are Jung. Jung is the 9th face on this list, and Marie-Louise von France is number 10. The prior 8 all came before Jung, and the only one of those that he actually met was Freud. So that means you've got, just on this slide, 8 thinkers in the lead up to Jung who have all said valuable things on this topic. And this is a very small selection, and you could spend a lifetime studying any one of these thinkers shown here. And we're not going to talk about this for hours here, but I am just going to offer a little bit by way of what each of these people contributed to this whole endeavor of self-knowledge. Now, Freud was all about self-knowledge, right? He was the first person to really medicalize philosophy as it pertained to the mind. He wasn't the guy who discovered the unconscious or coined the unconscious, but we owe a lot to him for his work in popularizing and spreading an understanding of the unconscious. He had great differences with Jung, and Jung understood the mythological grounding to all this stuff. Freud pretty much rejected all of that, thought that it was all personal, there was no collective element. But he himself was clearly a genius who contributed so much to our understanding and was an advocate for self-knowledge. Every one of these people here not only showed great self-knowledge, but communicated in their work that self-knowledge is the process. This is what we're here to do. I'm going to go right back now to the start of the list. So the first person on this list is Jakob Böhm, who was a German mystic. He was born in the late 16th century, lived for about 50 years or so, and he was a humble cobbler who had a mystical experience in his mid-20s. And what really defined his experience, that was completely heretical at the time, was that he had a direct experience of what he sort of described as the dark side of God, understanding that God himself could have a wrathful, destructive side. Now, exactly what that means exactly to what extent that might be evil or maybe even good. We're going to be exploring that more and more as this series goes on. But clearly, there's actually a good side to that as well. This is coming from God after all. But within the context of the time, to come out and say that was a death sentence. God is all good. Right? So Christianity set up God and Jesus as though they were entirely good, and in the same breath created Satan as the shadow, as the opposite to that. But a lot of these thinkers build on Böhm. Not all of these thinkers directly built on or explicitly built on those that came before. They didn't consider this necessarily to be a direct lineage. There's branches here. I mean, Jung, for example, was very critical of Hegel, but probably actually owed more to Hegel than he lets on. I mean, this whole model that I'm describing here is an attempt to synthesize Hegel and Jung to a large extent. But all of these guys have a role in it. So the second image is George Berkeley, an Irish bishop, who was famous for the phrase, "to be is to be perceived," or, depending on the translation, being is perception. So this was a form of idealism, very different from what came subsequently from the Germans. But the idea that what we experience is what there is. If you asked George Berkeley, if a tree falls in the forest and no one is there to perceive it, does it really fall? He probably would have said no. I mean, surely the tree falling is the experience of the tree falling. There's nothing outside of that. Now, our intuitions tend to go against this. However, more recent discoveries in quantum physics, for example, do seem to corroborate this, that the observer at least has a role in what actually unfolds. Well, Berkeley went quite a lot further and described how God plays this role as like the ultimate observer. So God's existence is that which observes and mediates everything that's occurring. But this idea that if you see something, if you perceive anything, whether it's someone behaving a certain way and maybe you judge that as, unkind, let's say, or selfish, are you wrong? This is a nuance that shadow work, as it's often practiced, doesn't explore in any great depth. And yet it's absolutely fundamental to the philosophy that led to it. Are you wrong? If you judge someone, what does that even mean, firstly, to judge? And if you perceive them as selfish, rude, unkind, arrogant, all of these things, evil, to what extent is that true? So, even though the German idealists were from a different lineage, there's value there that can be applied to their philosophy. Hegel, I think, would have probably thought about it like this. There is some kind of momentary truth in that. Remember the analogy of the photograph? Like I mentioned in the last episode, that a photograph of you is in a way you, and in another way it's not you. You can't really say it's not you. It clearly is. Well, in a similar kind of way, when we experience something a certain way, it's part of reality, is it not? There's something there. Now, the errors we make is when we extrapolate absolute truth onto that perception and believe it is what it is and it's all it is, rather than seeing it as a carrier for something, just like in the shadow map. And when we perceive selfishness or rudeness, are we also seeing a carrier for the antidote? Are we seeing something that actually also represents the capacity to practice legitimate self-care? Can you be selfish without practicing self-care? Maybe, but to an extent you're also practicing self-care there. Can you practice self-care without being selfish? Well, yes, you can, but only once you've integrated its opposite. And only then can you do it consciously. So, go after that is Immanuel Kant. Everyone's heard of Kant, right? So, very pivotal philosopher in Germany, greatly influenced everyone else that was to come. And one area in which his work was really relevant to Jung and everything Jung was about was his description of what he called the noumenal world versus the phenomenal world. That is, things as they are in themselves, the noumenon, versus things as they merely appear to us in the phenomenal world. This idea that there is some kind of deeper essence, it certainly didn't begin with Kant. Right? It goes right back as long as humans go back. But at least in our civilization's philosophy, think of Plato and his world of forms. Now, Plato learned a lot from the Egyptians, and there was a lot more that happened before that. The records of what came before Plato have, of course, greatly faded now, unfortunately. But this simple idea that what we experience as phenomena is not all there is. There's something unseen, something hidden. And this naturally gives rise to the idea of an unconscious. The unconscious was a vital concept that persisted through the works of the idealists, people like Fichte, Schelling, Hegel. So the next figure here, Fichte, actually called Kant's noumenon into question. So, well, if there's some world out there, some realm that we have no access to, is that even relevant for a start? But are we not giving it relevance, or are we not deducing its existence by setting a boundary? Therefore, we're already actually saying something about it, aren't we? So how can you both say that you're not able to say anything about it while simultaneously saying something about it? Quite a clear contradiction now, it would seem, but it wasn't clear to many folks at the time. And Fichte, a young guy, came up and pointed this out and became very famous very quickly. So Schelling, again, talk a lot about him in this program. Hegel, huge influence on all of this. These guys were trying to reconcile various problems of Kant's. And this is now the core of German idealism. So Hegel introduced the dialectical process. Actually, Fichte talked about it a lot as well, but Hegel's famous for that subject at least, and taking it further. This dialectical development of existence. Very nuanced thinking, very intricate, and in combination with each other, the three of them offer something that's very systemized. Each of them sort of tries to present a holistic philosophy on their own, but each of them also leaves certain things out which the others have a way of handling. So, for example, Fichte didn't really talk about nature. Nature was a huge part of Schelling's philosophy. Why is there nature? Where does nature come from? What is nature for? Why does it exist? Whereas Hegel was more interested in the dialectical development of the state and of society throughout history. He presented a philosophy of history, not a history of philosophy, but a philosophy of history. So thinking about it, actually, you see how these three thinkers, Fichte, Schelling, and Hegel, they loosely align to the three worlds outlined by the existentialists. In other words, you've got the I world, the Eigenwelt, the Umwelt, the around world, so that's what Schelling brings to the table, and the Mitwelt, or the social world. So it's not a direct correlation there, but you can see how they align pretty well to those three areas. They each explore and philosophize within those areas, emphasizing each of those three areas. Schopenhauer, of course, we've already talked a bit about Schopenhauer. Nietzsche, what else? There's a lot to say about Nietzsche, but being at this very pivotal lineman where finally it's like, he really marked the moment at which culture finally recognized both the end of religion as we had known it and the dangers that brought with it. Well, I think it's fair to say that a lot of folks are still completely oblivious to those dangers, no doubt, but Nietzsche really established that in philosophy. And of course, Jung ran with a lot of this stuff. All of this directly led to Jung's work around his discussion of the unconscious, his understanding of the noumenon as presented by Kant, and why this is relevant, why it was relevant in Jung's time, why it's still relevant today, why it is that merely establishing religiosity as a way to connect with ourselves is no longer sufficient, and it has a place and it's not wrong, but there's certain externalities that have been left behind. Materialism, on the other hand, I mean, Nietzsche and others before him, including the likes of Schelling, astutely predicted the dangers that were to come. If we have no values, we can create our own values. Great. But who's to say that our own values are what's right for us? And how can we possibly know? This is amounting to nothing more than a complete denial of the unconscious, complete denial of our own personal unconscious, but a complete disconnection from God and spirit and what there is. Oh, we don't need that. We can just build things and make our lives comfortable. No, there's always a way. There's always a way that the world will conspire to make us confront what's been left behind, both individually and collectively. So Jung's work incorporates aspects of all of these guys. Like every single one of them feeds into Jung's work somehow. So he's certainly a linchpin that brings a lot of this together. Certain key things left out, but certain key things really explored and elaborated upon, and most importantly of all, turned into a psychology, turned into something that can actually be applied in a medical setting and also in a personal inner work setting and a coaching setting. But like I say, there's a lot that's left out, and these other thinkers here all have great things to offer to help us really make sense of things that maybe don't make sense in the way shadow work is often discussed. Marie-Louise von Franz took his work further as well, made great contributions to the practice of active imagination, and also in understanding the workings and mechanics of projection. But these last three figures here, Freud, Jung, von Franz, it's important to emphasize, just as Jung did, that they were psychologists. They were medical professionals, from one perspective. Jung himself said, I speak to you as a physician, like a surgeon who simply has to solve a problem, address a symptom. Now, Jung certainly was a philosopher by another name. He certainly did do philosophy, even though he wasn't wearing a philosopher's hat. It's just unavoidable. And there's a good case to be made that Jung's psychology was a way of carrying philosophy into a psychologically minded or a materially minded audience. If he'd just come out like Hegel, he wouldn't have had the same impact. There's a place for that. In the truest Hegelian way, is there a place for that? And in a similar kind of way, Jung actually also criticized Hegel as being like a philosopher in psychologist garb. You might even say that Hegel was a mystic in philosopher's garb. Philosophy is the love of wisdom or the love of truth. It's no different from mysticism in that respect. And yet, many concessions are made to the expectations of the world, which is most ironic given the quote we looked at earlier from Schopenhauer. So then, I'm going to briefly talk about the tarot here. Now, I don't want to go into this in huge depth just because there isn't much time left of this episode, but the tarot is an ancient system of symbols that depicts not only shadow work very accurately, but also the archetypes themselves. It's a logically sound, consistent system that is, I think, humankind's best attempt to present a symbolic library that is both accurate and comprehensive. So this has a lot to offer in the world of shadow work, not least individuation, not least inner work more broadly. There is no idea in the world or no experience that cannot be mapped to the tarot somewhere. If you're watching the video here, I'm actually displaying the major arcana. So this is the first 22 cards of the tarot. There's also two other parts of the deck. You've got the minor arcana and the court cards. The minors represent more like daily life situations, and the court cards represent personality traits and certain individuals embodying said traits. There's reasons behind all of this, esoteric reasons that justify this, which is not the place to get into now. But what I will say is that clearly shadow work and the inner work journey is not a new idea. It's been symbolically present for as long as humans have. It's been implicit in the human psyche for as long as humans have existed. And it has been presenting itself symbolically for as long as humans have been making art, for as long as humans have been communicating, and as long as humans have been converting perception into conception and conception into perception. In terms of shadow work, there's some very interesting things we can derive from the tarot. I'll share a couple briefly here. The first is that, let's look at card number 12, the Hanged Man. What's going on here? Well, think about it. If you divide the deck in two, you have two sets of 11 cards, with the Magician coming first and the Fool coming last. The Fool representing both the start and the end of the journey. Well, what you have is the Magician as card number 1, the top of the first half, and the Hanged Man as card number 12, the top of the second half. So it is literally like an inverted magician. It is literally like spirit inverting itself in order to come to know itself. When we think about the Christian story, the crucifixion of Jesus, what comes up? What are we to make of that? Jesus being the Son of God, being the physical manifestation of God on earth, why on earth would he choose to suffer? There's a very profound lesson in all of that about the nature, utility, and necessity of suffering. If God himself is coming to earth, knowing what fate befalls him, and going through with it, what does that mean for our understanding and conception and experience of suffering? I'll leave that one there. So let's pick out another one here. Let's look at these two cards, the Lovers and the Devil. That's card 6 and card 15. Here you'll notice that these two figures, a man and a woman, Adam and Eve, are present on both cards. In the Lovers, it's quite a pretty scene. There's a hill in the background. There's an angel above them, apparently bringing them together, but possibly also pushing them apart or separating them out. In the Devil, we have the same characters, but here under slavery, taken under the control of this menacing devil figure. Well, what are we to make of this? The Devil is card 15, the Lovers is card 6. Numerologically, 15 reduces to 6, because 5 plus 1 is 6. So there's clearly a relationship between these two cards. Astrologically, they represent Gemini, that's the Lovers, and Capricorn, that's the Devil. Curiously, it's also just occurred to me that taroscopically, that is using Michael Tsarian's taroscopic method of drawing up charts, those who have Gemini as their star sign, most of them also have Capricorn as their rising sign. If you want to understand why that is, then you check out his book. It's called Cards on Houses, where he goes into this. That's very interesting, actually. It's almost like the Pamela Coleman Smith who designed these cards, or with the help of Arthur Waite. Were they tapping into this too? That actually, for those born in Gemini, the sign rising on the eastern horizon at nightfall is Capricorn. It's cardinal Earth. So there's an astrological link between these two cards. But where this becomes very relevant to the shadow map, well, it's like this. The Lovers is discriminating, differentiating, splitting apart. What appears to be one thing is actually two, right? It's not merely shadow, it's light shadow. It's not selfish, it's self-care. It's not kindness, it's selfless. It's not efficient, it's ruthless. It might not be flexible, it might just be unreliable. Now, of course, each of those pairs of terms I just reeled off, they each contain a bit of each other. There is no ultimate, essential split between them, but the mind makes the split. And it has to. There's nothing wrong with that. It doesn't matter what Eastern traditions tell you or imply about the corrupt nature of thought. No, this is part of Spirit's journey. We have to do this. But what's inevitably going to happen is that the very same ideas come to insist upon themselves or must be taken to their end. And if we're not careful, they then themselves become traps. And perhaps it's actually only in encountering them as traps, being bound by our own thinking, our own self-contradiction that's contained within every single idea. That's how we come to understand them as they really are. So just as, let's look at the shadow map again, our conscious thesis becomes used in service of power because we want to be that way. It's not merely the encounter with the unknown that strikes fear in us. It's the separation from the known. That's a Krishnamurti quote. So in just the same way, if we see ourselves as very structured, and that's how we've learned to survive and get by and get approval and create results in the world, at some point that's going to become rigid. We're going to become trapped by our own need to be that way. And the antidote to that is that we must learn flexibility. Not to become unreliable, because God knows we really don't want to be unreliable. If we see ourselves as structured, unreliable is most likely the last thing we want to be. But in order to be truly disciplined, in order to be truly structured, we need to stop merely hanging out with the idea of structure. And the way to do that is to engage with its antidote, which is flexibility. Therefore, back to the tarot, if we never met the devil, we'd never truly overcome it. We'd never be able to become who we really are. So it's a necessity that we do. It may even be a self-generated necessity. It's all part of Spirit's wisdom. It's all part of the ride. So, that said, I'm going to wrap up this episode. Thank you for your time and attention. I'll see you in the next one.